This is one of those sermons that require a trigger warning. So at any point, if you ever feel like you need self-care, if you need to get up and move around or leave this room, I totally understand. And of course, at some point, if you need to talk to me, another religious professional, or even a therapist, please note that that is indeed hopefully available for you. When we talk about ancestral trauma, probably the first thing that comes to many of our minds are those, particularly of African descent, who have been enslaved throughout the years. And we could point down south and say that, yeah, that's their issue. We here in Canada were magnanimous enough to be the recipient of whatever comes our way from the Underground Railroad. But I did a little bit of history digging, and guess what? We have a history of slavery here in Canada as well that was not abolished until 1834, and that was not through a civil war, but rather through an edict by the British government, right? So there is that bit of history here, and in fact, it looks a little different because 2/3 out of the 4,000 or so enslaved people were actually indigenous people, while a third were of African descent. And again, we could point to the fact that yes, our siblings further down north did have 3 decades more of slavery, and it was gruesome throughout that whole entire time, with beatings and other horrific acts of discipline, in quotes, if enslaved people did not obey their masters. So we can point to that as being the source of ancestral trauma that did not just end with the abolition of slavery. Let's talk about Jim Crow laws and public hangings, especially in the South. And let's talk about these domestic terrorists known as the Ku Klux Klan, right? And to this day, let's look at the Madison Square Garden rally that took place not too long ago. We don't need to look very far back in history to recognize the amount of racialized trauma that exists in society and in our bodies. And another incident that I want to mention in terms of ancestral trauma has to do with residential schools here in Canada. So one of the first movies I saw when I moved here this past summer is a movie and a documentary called Sugarcane. And I had an opportunity to actually meet the co-directors of this film, Emily Cassie and Julian Brave Noisecat. I would highly recommend this movie if you have a chance to watch it. So Julian Brave Noisecat is of indigenous origin, a First Nations person, and his father, Ed Archie, was actually found at a residential school in British Columbia, not going to the school, but as an abandoned baby on top of an incinerator. And he was found by a delivery person who accidentally ran into him. And he was one of the only known survivors of babies who were burned alive. I don't know how else to put this, right? Can you just imagine the trauma that he went through? And then his adoptive mother, so Julian's grandmother, had a hard time talking about her own atrocities going through that residential school and the sexual abuse that she experienced on the hands of the priests who were supposed to be there to educate her and provide a safe learning environment. This is the kind of generational trauma that Julian had to deal with. I could only imagine how hard it must have been to be the director and one of the people doing the interviews, and one of the people speaking out in the documentary itself about what it means to experience this intergenerational trauma. Now, unless we just relegate ancestral trauma to BIPOC folks, to Black, Indigenous people of color, you might be interested to know that white people experience trauma as well. And this isn't to say that I'm somehow giving perpetrators a pass. But again, let's go back to slavery. And let's talk about the fact that the people who are dehumanizing another individual on some level, deep down, is also experiencing trauma. Because when we dehumanize another, we dehumanize ourselves. And again, I could only imagine the trauma that the people who had to burn those babies had to go through in terms of the theological disconnect. Thou shalt not murder. And infanticide is a form of murder. And how could you claim to be pro-life if you could do that to another human being, right? So I could only imagine the amount of trauma from settler white people having to go through those horrific acts of violence against other human beings. And again, I did some more research, and even white people who were brought here from England, so-called home children, experienced trauma in their lives. So beginning in 1869, orphans and poor people who had to send their children away ended up here in Canada. Not to be adopted by families that would care for them, but ended up working farmlands and factories and other places as indentured laborers. And I've talked to a member of this congregation that has had ancestors that went through that process. And they are so ashamed to talk about it that it's almost like a well-hidden secret because the pain is so strong. And guess what? That trauma lives on today. When you have children being taken away from their communities and their places of origin and just plopped into another country altogether, no matter how well treated they are, there's still that trauma from separation and that trauma from being uprooted from your ancestral land. We witness this today with all the refugees that come to this country and the trauma that they must have gone through. Sorry, this is not a light subject that we're talking about here this morning, but I feel like we have to mention it because I myself, even though I'm not Indigenous and I'm not a person of African descent, my family lineage has also experienced trauma. You saw, well, let me rewind a little bit and talk to you about when I was in seminary, I was trying to fill out this Geniogram exercise that we were all supposed to engage with. And so I talked to my parents and I said, can you tell me more about your parents? And none of them, neither of them, I should say, were able to go past their parents, right? Which says a lot right there about why is that they somehow have this ancestral amnesia about our family line. So I wasn't close at all with my paternal grandparents, and they kind of died when I was young. And even my maternal grandfather died when I was young as well. So the only person I could have even talked to was my maternal grandmother, whose picture you saw in the slide presentation. And she was born to a fourth concubine basically, and who couldn't take care of her. So she was raised in an orphanage in a small island on the eastern part of China called Golongsu, which I finally had a chance to visit this past April, by the way, and I got to walk to the school where my grandmother went to school and to experience what she must have gone through being raised in that orphanage with very meager means. And her form of escape, because remember, at this time too, a lot of Chinese girls had their feet bound, right? As a way for them to not escape from their husbands or not escape from their particular situation, which was, I could only imagine, again, the trauma that comes with that. But for my grandmother, it was not even knowing when her birthday was. So when she was just dropped off at that orphanage, she didn't know when that was, and so we didn't even know when to celebrate her birthday. But she endured nonetheless, and her form of escape was marrying my maternal grandfather, who was the one who brought her to the Philippines, and she had to start her life anew. And even, as I mentioned, after my grandfather died, she then had 12 or 13 kids that she had to take care of. And again, she couldn't do that all by herself. Again, this is a time when women did not have economic freedom and self-agency at that point, right? So she had to give up 3 of her children. And I could only imagine how difficult that decision must have been, as well as for the 3 children who were then given up for adoption, of the sense of abandonment that they must have felt. So I, in turn, have inherited that level of trauma. And I didn't realize this and I didn't recognize this until years later when I had to deal with another traumatic situation in my life, which I'll get to 2 weeks from now. How's that for a cliffhanger, right? And a way to get you to come back. And the way I did this was a couple years ago, I actually got a sabbatical from the UUA after working for 7 years with the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association. And I decided to take just 2 or 3 months to go around the world and go to quote unquote thin places, places where the line between the spiritual and the physical realm are pretty thin, right? So I snorkeled the Great Barrier Reef. I went to Victoria Falls in Africa, and I did a week-long pilgrimage with the Camino de Santiago in Spain, right? And then I came back, and then I left again for a week-long ayahuasca retreat. I don't know how many of you have heard of ayahuasca. So it's a plant-based medicine that's been around for a very long time, and the indigenous people in the Amazon jungle have used it as a healing mechanism, right? So this is another admission. It was the first illicit drug I have ever taken. Unlike Bill Clinton, I did not even inhale or come across any pot, to my knowledge anyway, right? Ever in my life. Which is why my colleague, Julika, when I told her I was going to do this, said, "Are you crazy? Are you just going to jump right into a hallucinogen without even having a gateway drug first to get you up there somehow?" And I said, yes, I am committed to this process of doing a reset in my life because I heard that ayahuasca is a way of purging, basically, right? And purging is a euphemism for when people usually ingest it, they throw up and they vomit, or they have to use the bathroom. So we have to have a guide, and when we yell baño, to take us to the bathroom to do a number 2 or whatever, right? Number 2 or 3, I don't know. But So anyway, I did do some research ahead of time. I watched Zac Efron's Down to Earth, and I watched another Netflix documentary called How to Change Your Mind about the effects of hallucinogens. And by the way, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands of how many of you experimented back in the 60s and 70s with like LSD and psilocybins and mushrooms and other things, right? But I could see a few of you nodding. But let's just say I wanted to do it in a controlled environment, and it was indeed administered by a father and son shaman. And so I was there deep in the Amazon jungle, and initially the drug kind of took its time, plant-based medicine, I should say, took its time to finally take effect in my body. And interestingly enough, I could not throw up. I wish I did, actually, because throwing up actually provides relief. Because one feels so nauseous and so tense and bottled up and whatever inside that throwing up and purging is actually a way to get rid of all that energy and find comfort. And so this one night, I believe it was the third night that I took it. So again, we were there for a week, but we didn't take the medicine every night. I remember when the shamans started chanting, my body started moving uncontrollably. It was as if I was dancing. And the reason why I know it's uncontrollable is because I do not know how to dance, right? I do not possess those moves at all. So when I was dancing there, I was like, oh my gosh, what's happening to me? And I suddenly became so ashamed, and I began thinking, what are my fellow participants gonna think about me? And you know what? It's super dark. You know, that's the reality. So they probably couldn't even see. And again, they were too busy throwing up themselves, right? Like, who gives a darn about what I'm doing in the middle of the room there? And then I saw a vision of my ancestors surrounding me. And again, I didn't recognize their faces because as I just told you before, the only person I knew was my grandmother. And to my knowledge, I didn't even see her as part of the ancestors that were surrounding me. And I thought to myself, oh boy, here we go. They're gonna start judging my dancing skills by holding up scorecards like 10 or 0 or whatever, right? But no, they had a very non-expressive face, you know, like kind of more like a poker face on. They were just watching, observing me do my thing. But each time I danced, believe it or not, it actually brought relief for me. It was as if I let something go during that process. And then I began going through this litany of forgiveness. At that point, I just decided to forgive my ancestors for the trauma that I inherited, thanks to them. And I forgave them and I forgave my parents, and I forgave my ex. And each time I went through that litany of forgiveness, I felt a little lighter, and I felt a little bit more at home in my body. And I was trying to figure out why am I still feeling nauseous? Why am I still feeling icky here? And it was because there's one more person I haven't forgiven throughout this whole litany. And that's right, that's myself, right? And I was like, here I am too, judging myself. I'm the only one holding up a scorecard, right? Because nobody else cares how ridiculous I look, except for me. And that's when I realized that judgment and love cannot coexist in the same place at that same time. And that in order for me to engage, truly engage in this healing process, I needed to let go of all the judgments that was going around in my mind. So that was a very powerful moment for me of realizing that the body is really where this lies, and that the body keeps the score, as Bessel van der Kolk said in his New York Times bestselling book, right? And that all of us, at some point, I believe, have experienced some kind of trauma, whether it's ancestral trauma or trauma that we've accumulated throughout our lives. And the question is, what do we do when we experience this trauma? Because we've all probably heard the expression too that hurt people, right? That pain that is not transformed is transmitted on to others. So how can we say that, yes, while we may have inherited this from the past, the buck stops here, and that the violence ends now and with me? And how do we do that? Listen to our bodies. What do our bodies need right now, you know? And I think the failure sometimes of, you know, Western medicine, so to speak, is that that's kind of the default, that we go to medication and prescribe Prozac. Not to say that people don't need it to balance out the chemicals in their brains at some point or another, and not to diss talk therapy at all, because trust me, while I was going through this whole past 4 years, I went through weekly therapy. And I also realized that even within the realm of therapy, psychotherapy, there's a nod these days to how helpful and healing EMDR is, for example, right? Which is a way to engage the body as well in the therapeutic process, and even tapping and yoga and other things supplanted and supplemented by talk therapy could do wonders to heal us. And these days, even in seminaries, Starr King School for the Ministry, for example, has classes now on plant-based medicines. And again, we have a lot to learn from Indigenous First Nations people about the use of that, right? And again, in a controlled and safe environment. And again, I think Amy talked to you all about this in September, and with both the Date with Death group this past Thursday, right? I'm seeing a few nods from those of you who attended that. So there's all kinds of ways that we could engage our whole entire being and listen to how wise our bodies are, and to trust what it has to say about how we engage in this healing process. Enough talking. I said a bunch of words right there. So here's what I want to leave you with, because I recognize that 2 days from now, and here's the other admission, is that every 4 years, right around this time, and I'm not talking about the Olympics, it gives me PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Because I remember back even to 2008 when I was working on educating religious communities about the importance of marriage equality in California, because there was a law that was just passed that allowed for that, and then they put it in the ballot box in November to take that right away, right? Again, I don't know how many of you remember Prop 8 or have heard about it. I was so devastated when that passed. It was a personal attack on my identity and my whole entire being and my values, my UU values that I worked so hard to propagate out in the community, to have that sense of loss. And every election since, I must say, which is part of why you all got me here in Canada, right? Because I'm like, I'm done with that. I'm not into fascism. I'm sorry, folks. But it's not in alignment with my values. So this coming Tuesday, I'm preaching to myself here, how can we be kind to our bodies? So in 2016, I decided to just spend a whole day at the spa. right? To preempt and take care of myself at that moment. And how can we take care of each other? How can we check in with each other from time to time and ask, how are we doing? And what are we doing as our spiritual practices to take care of our bodies? So why don't we begin now and find that place in your body where you feel the stress, where you feel the discomfort. I'm noticing that a few of you are putting your feet on the ground so that you feel connected to the earth. And even the act of breathing in and out is a form of body treatment and paying attention to the wisdom within the breath of our ancestors. And close your eyes if you want to. You don't have to, but that might lessen the sense of self-judgment or other judging even. And perhaps touch that part of your body where you feel that ache, where you feel that pain, where you feel the stress. Perhaps massage it and pay attention to it to try to release the tension, make it feel good. Or you have permission to dance in your seats. As long as you're not hitting anybody else, I'm cool with that. Do whatever it is to release that trauma that resides in you. Because we know that the body keeps the score, and the body always wins, no matter how hard our minds try to suppress it. So let's just be kind to ourselves and remind ourselves that whenever we are breathing in, we can access this moment when we feel connected one to the other. We are part of a larger bodies. And this larger body is what holds us, connects us, shows us all the love that we need. Let's take a few more moments, just enjoying our breathing and showing kindness to our bodies.